Well, hello everyone. You can probably hear from my voice that I'm a little better than the last time. I think I actually had pneumonia. It lasted a long time. I'm almost back to normal. So here goes in another episode. This episode is actually sort of a continuation to some degree of the last one, which was called The Slippery Slope of Ideology. And the question I asked at the end of the last one, in a very deep and raspy voice, was as follows. What do we do about this information control problem? What is the antidote to this us and theming that's being inflamed with information control? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So people got really involved in this question, and I got a lot of very thoughtful and intelligent responses from my Patreon members, people on YouTube and Instagram. And it's an interesting puzzle because many people feel, well, I just have to choose one side or the other of any conflict, which ordinarily I might say, okay, that could be true. But when another third party is stoking the conflict, different measures might be required. So I'm going to get into some of that in this episode. But there's a few people that left comments that I'd love to read. Macy LeBlanc says, black and white thinking, aka us versus them, is definitely hard to navigate, but it's not all bad. It's an important stage in brain development and a natural part of maturing. It is most important during adolescence, where individuals are forming their identity through trial and error. Adolescents and young adults are the most powerful society changers of any age group, and it's because of that black and white thinking. Interesting. Without it, change would be extremely slow and humanity as a whole would suffer. Yeah, change would be slow. Change is important, but it usually isn't spearheaded by the older, gray-haired, middle ground, level-headed people. Hey, what are you trying to say? Being comfortable in the gray areas of thoughts, opinions, and beliefs can take a lifetime of wisdom building. All right, yeah, I hear you. Some never grow out of the us versus them mentality. So as much as us versus them can be detrimental, it also brings about goodness too, as long as it doesn't go too much into the extremes. Sadly, the internet, media, and narcissists take advantage of this natural and important stage in development. So it's less about stopping this kind of thinking. It's instead keeping it out of the extremes while kids are young and helping people develop into wisdom as they intellectually and emotionally mature. That is true. I think calling out abusive influence, aiding people to notice this pattern is the best way to keep it out of extremes. I agree, and that's what I'm trying to do. Another comment, Callis. I see what you want to say here, but I think that everyone is always equally guilty of everything is just as wrong as mindless us versus them. Focus on spotting the pattern and acting on it where applicable. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sort of saying, everyone's guilty of everything, but let me continue. Margot Channing, what is the solution to information control? I don't even know where to begin to even start thinking about it because they're having that same conversation. I think you mean the people that are controlling all the information. Yes, they are thinking about that. One more interesting, good wavelength. I get not taking a side, but taking the human side. But sometimes taking the human side, we get labeled as being on a political side. And if you just observe and don't speak up for humans, it feels deeply wrong. Yes, I agree. I just want you guys to know that's not what I'm saying either. I'm not saying don't speak up. But let me continue a little longer. Bellzilla. But if we agree both sides are coercive, how do we determine how to move the town, city, state, country, universe forward? Unfortunately, in the US anyway, we're still at the lesser of two evils options. And I'm seeing too many people not realizing that, panicking and getting on board with that unfortunateness. Yes. So I think something important is, when I talk about the us versus them, and I've been alluding to triangulation, when people are being triangulated against each other, there are more than just one option or the other. There's another option. Let me get to that. Antonella. I would say that human beings need to be in a world where they feel most comfortable in a state of duality. The state of misinformation is a symptom of our need to vilify or you're good or bad. We're told stories when we're children to teach us lessons to beware of the big bad wolf, etc. We're reaching for our fearful primal survival states of mind. In addition, people are not taught critical thinking skills, so that creates deeper, poor ways of approaching life. Standing back and noticing the pattern is a great start, but you had to take sides as well and fight the cult. Exactly. So I'm not saying that because both sides are doing some of the same shit, like everything's screwed. There is another option. I want to talk about triangulation. So let me tell you a story about, those of you that read my blog, my whistleblower blog, know the story. There was a cult deprogram called Rick Ross. During my entire time at NXIVM, there was this guy called Rick Ross, not the rapper, the cult expert. And I was told by Raniere and by everyone around him and by Nancy Salzman that Rick Ross was a horrible, horrible human being. A psychopath, just a horrible human being who was being paid vast amounts of money to attack NXIVM. In fact, they were saying that he was getting like, I don't know, it was 40 or 60,000 a month, that he was in this new apartment in the Upper West Side. And I bought it. I believed that. So those of us in the NXIVM community hated Rick Ross. He was the enemy. Now, what was really fascinating is that when I woke up, I decided to call Rick Ross. But when I realized Raniere was not who I thought he was, and that I realized the shit was really bad, I called Rick Ross and I had an amazing conversation with him. It's the first time I ever spoke to him. I just hated him from afar. And, he took my call. He knew exactly who I was. He could probably hear from the way I was speaking that I was waking up. And he advised me and he helped me in very, very deep ways. And I thought to myself, it's so interesting. Here I've hated this man for over a decade, who I never spoke to, never met, never checked on the information I was being told about him. I just bought it all. And it turns out Rick Ross was not the enemy. I thought he was the enemy. The enemy was Raniere. Raniere was triangulating all of us. He was having all of us hate Rick Ross. And Rick Ross had Raniere's number. Rick Ross would show up in court because they were in a constant battle in court for many years. Rick Ross would show up in court and he wouldn't give Raniere what he wanted, which is all power and all control. And Raniere hated him. And Nancy Salzman hated him. I didn't know any of this. I just believed that Rick Ross was trying to take us down, trying to take our mission down, trying to take Keith Raniere down. So it wasn't just the option of like, oh, well, either Rick Ross is right or we're right. There was a third option. And the third option was Raniere was the problem. So that's very, very important. And let me continue. Katie Brahm, the us versus theming that's been going on seems to severely lack empathy for each respective side. We need to do better. We're split into sides because of differences of opinion and points of view. But perhaps there are fewer differences than the values we have in common with each other. Those with the most control and authority want us divided, and I know that we're playing right into their traps too. That's exactly right. It is also interesting because it's like our empathy goes offline. We're told who to hate, we believe it, and our empathy goes offline. We no longer see them as humans, we just hate them. And I think we have this massive empathy deficit in our society because people are entranced by the messaging of corporate controlled legacy media. So one more thought before I get to my next little piece. Melissa Clemens, she says, we need to recognize that divided people are easier to control and manipulate. We need to do what's best for everyone and actually be able to talk and see other points of view. Maybe not agree, but just understand their point of view. Yes, very wise. Andy, I think one solution is to point out positives in individuals in that other group. There's one actor whose political views I completely disagree with, but he's also been on podcasts related to a show he used to be on, and his insights into his craft are interesting. So I think you can illustrate that a person can be in a cult or equivalent and not be acting as a cult member 24/7. Portray the other as humans and not as mindless drones. So that's really interesting because I do keep thinking about what if we actually were to understand this person that we're supposed to hate. Now, look, are there people legitimately doing horrible fucking things? Absolutely. But one of the problems I've been having is that I am being told who the problem is. And I don't necessarily check, I just believe. So there's a really interesting podcast that I saw recently. It was a podcast from Andrew Gold. He has a podcast called The Heretics, YouTube channel and a podcast. And he had Richard Grannon on, who's an expert in all things narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and complex PTSD. And I want to play you this section. I got Andrew's permission to play this. Let me just play you this section. It's really interesting. It's about the Socratic Method.
Well, the kind of thing that I suppose I'm alluding to, which is we got to bring the Socratic Method back to the way we hold dialogue. We have to bring reason back. Socratic Method would be, I mean, strictly speaking, for the Socratic Method to be the Socratic Method, you say there's two genders. Let's take that as an example. I say no, there's as many genders as you want. Before we debate, you have to express my position to me, to my full satisfaction.
Oh, I like that.
And I have to express your full position to you, to your. If it's not to your satisfaction, I have to keep going and keep going and keep until I get it right.
Right.
And then you say, go on then, lads, now argue. Now I fully know what you mean, and you're hearing me, and I'm hearing you. It's simple.
Why don't we all do that?
That's base level philosophy. It's like philosophy 101. And we should absolutely, imagine how many debates would end if we simply were forcing each other. Well, sorry, forcing is a bit. The dictator in me is coming out.
Imagine how many if we force people with handcuffs.
If we encourage them gently to engage in the Socratic Method, we would resolve so many issues so quickly. I mean, again, it's away from narcissism, away from ego. We've got this platform, we've got social media, we want to be seen, and you want your gotcha moment. So like Andrew Gold destroys narcissism expert with 2 million views. Narcissism's not real. And I'm there going, oh, sorry about that. People love it. Okay. So that's the environment. That's the incentives that are created in the environment. It's incentives driven.
So the reason I find this so interesting is because, and the fact that Richard Grannon says it's philosophy 101, I find philosophy so interesting because philosophy allows for the recognition that people have different frameworks through which they see the world. They have different perspectives, as opposed to, a hardcore religion, which is this is the right perspective and that's it. And the problem is what I'm seeing is a lot of religiosity, a lot of religious behavior. There is only this way and there's no understanding of another way and no desire to understand the other. And that's what I think is interesting about philosophy. And what we end up doing is we end up fighting straw men of the other side. We're not fighting the other side really. We're fighting a representation that we've been offered and given and told this is true, but it's a straw man argument that we're fighting against. It's not the real person or group. So I find that a very interesting idea to be able to articulate what the other is saying. Because we're told this group of people are complete assholes, but then, if I go and talk to somebody from that group and I listen to them, I start to find that's interesting. This doesn't match what I'm being told about them. Like I'm being told they're hateful this and whatever the names are, but they're just people. Now I'm not talking about hardcore real Nazis and horrible psychopaths and sociopaths. I'm talking about reasonable people who have a perspective and they're being painted a certain way. There's one more here, Philip Taylor, who really echoes this. He said, I started intentionally seeking out perspectives that were contrary to opinions I held, not just seeking out the opposite, culty voice of the other side of an issue, but actively seeking legitimate points from people I generally felt I disagreed with to hear what was being said that might cause me to question my assumptions. It helps, but there is a kind of membership with these perspectives that you divorce yourself from once you become committed to challenging your own biases and seek more nuanced and divergent possible factual information from heretical sources. Isn't that interesting? That if you're in some group and you begin to really do research on other to try to understand, that you could be cast out. And that's, by the way, how you know you're in a fucking cult. Because you should be able to investigate anything. And if you can't, there's a problem with your group. He continues, that sense of membership that is implicit with unquestionable agreement is seductive. It's true, it is. Certainly in cults, it becomes exploited to extremes, but even in daily life, skewing, is it a skewing or a shewing? Maybe you guys can tell me. I think it's maybe a skewing. Membership, to be honest, at least in the pursuit of accuracy, is challenging for me anyway. So just to answer some of the earlier things, I think it's imperative to take a moral stand. I'm not about not taking a stand, but we need to make sure that we're taking an informed stand. You know, the idea that everybody on the left, and particularly in Hollywood, are all a bunch of Satan-worshipping pedophiles is not true. It's not true. The idea that on the right, religious working class, blue-collar, uneducated workers are racist Nazi deplorables is also not true. It's really reductionist, and all it does is inflames people against each other and makes people hate each other. Most people are decent, caring people who want to live their lives, they want to pursue their dreams, they want to raise their families and be left alone. Those things do not make them terrorists. Those things make them human beings. So what's the antidote to this insanity? Well, one possible antidote is to actually do our own research. Now, I know that that concept has been vilified by people that want to nudge us away from critical thinking. I mean, certainly the last few years, large corporations, the news media said, don't do your research, like we're stupid somehow. But what if we did? What if we actually reached out to some of these people that are supposedly so horrible and actually had a conversation? Not a conversation with a straw man of them, an actual conversation with the actual person to find out, what do they actually believe? Not the sound bites that we've been given. What do they actually believe? So that's one possible antidote. So I think it might be good to figure out if the people you're being told to hate are in actual fact horrible psychopathic Nazis, or if we might be being misled. And this is the most important thing I want to sort of stress in this episode. The ones that are doing the misleading are actually the problem. It may not be what you think of as the other side. The ones that are doing the misleading, they're the problem. We need to look at the people that are actually doing the triangulation. We need to look up at the puppet masters pulling the strings that are telling us who the other side is and telling us that, that the rest of civilization depends on us destroying them because they're horrible, evil people. Understand that's how really, really bad shit happened in the world. These triangulators, they're the ones that are profiting of the conflict. They could be the actual enemy. It's not just one side versus another side, and those are the only two choices. Another choice is to see who's stoking the fires of hatred, because they're the actual problem. They could be the actual enemy. Stay curious.